So I just wanted to take a moment tonight, or today actually, to talk about reading difficult literature. As you guys start your literary or your lit sets where each of you are reading different books, you're going to be encountering some very difficult text. And unless you're used to this can sometimes be a very frustrating process where you're not quite sure what you're reading and you're not quite sure how the text is evolving. So I want to give you a few tips about how to interact with those difficult texts that should make it a lot easier for all of you guys. So I chose to use the text, The Bluest Eye, as an example because of all the other lit set books I've chosen. I have read all of those before. So I wanted to pick a book that I actually had not read before, that it was my very first time interacting with it, and kind of show you how I process reading a new text like that that's difficult and hard to understand. So I'm going to show you some examples of my book notes. So I've only gotten to the end right before autumn starts. So this should show you kind of how my brain is working so far as I interact through this difficult text. So, the first thing that happens here with The Bluest Eye is we start with this confusing kind of story about this house and this family. So if you don't know this story or the context of it, kind of a really popular children's series a while back was the Dick and Jane books. And a lot of kids were taught to read with these books. So I actually am going to have those of you who are assigned The Bluest Eye kind of look through some books of the Dick and Jane series so that you can see kind of what she's emphasizing here. But it's interesting that Toni Morrison chooses to open with almost this kid's story of the Dick and Jane books. So if you notice, I've already started writing in my book. So this is my first dry read. I haven't read it any other time. This is purely what was going through my mind as I interacted with this. So I noticed that we're opening with a Dick and Jane book, because I recognize the characters and kind of the text. So maybe you didn't recognize, if you weren't familiar with that, maybe you didn't recognize that right away, which is why it's so important to talk with people about what you're reading, because maybe someone understood that reference that you didn't, or maybe you end up understanding something or have a perspective on something that someone else didn't. So before I realized that it was opening with a Dick and Jane book, I thought it was interesting that the very first sentence is, "Here is a house." So that immediately made me write up here, why are they choosing to open this book with a house? What is a home? What is the symbolism of a house? And then I went to green and white. Why is it green and white? What does green and white symbolize? What does a red door symbolize? And then I started to realize that it was the Dick and Jane book. So I kind of went from there, and you see I made that connection, so I didn't have any other further notes here. But as we went to the second page, you see that same story that we saw on the first page be basically repeated word for word, but now there's no grammar. Notice that it is all one big sentence. Nothing is capitalized, not the names. There's no periods. There's no breakup of anything. So see how that compares to this? See all this grammar structure that we have here? That's gone here. And then we come down to this where absolutely everything is gone. There's no breakup of spacing in words. There's no grammar. We don't even end with a period. So the very first thing I'm thinking here is, why did Toni Morrison choose to do this? What is the literary purpose of this repetition, this breakdown of grammar, then a breakdown of all spacing and structure entirely? So I don't have the answer to this yet. As I'm getting ready to start this page, I don't have an answer to this yet. This is just something that I've noticed. So I make a note of it because I noticed it. It's obviously important. Otherwise, she wouldn't have started the book this way. And I need to understand why she started the book this way. But in order to kind of develop some basic theories, I need to read a little further before I can do that. So we move on to the second section, and we're already in a different story. You can tell by the breakup of the text how all of this is in italics. That's kind of something else to pay attention to, is how do the words change, how does their format change, everything like that. So we have this traditional format here that reads much like the kids' books did, and then we have this absence of grammar, and now we're moving back to grammar, but we're in italics here. So, this starts with, quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. Okay, so immediately have a setting. We know that we're working in 1941, so we know that we have to kind of understand some of that timeline there. What is that? What was it like then? And what was that time period like for our characters? So we don't really know much about our characters yet, but we're getting there. So this is an important note. Another thing is that I'm not the best gardener in the world, but I don't really understand what quiet has to do with growing marigolds. As far as I know, you don't really have to have quiet to grow plants. So I note that. How does quiet associate with marigolds? And then I've also said, okay, why are we opening with marigolds? What's the symbolism here? So as we move down into the second line, we thought at that time that it was because Piccola was having her father's baby that the marigolds did not grow. So immediately, this is alarming to me because I'm just like, wait, what? Piccola is having her father's baby? What does that mean? So I note off to the side, is this a metaphor? Does this just mean that her child is going to end up looking exactly like her father? Or does this mean that we're looking at some incest in this storyline so far? And then as we move down, I'm starting to see some kind of strong language here. A little examination and much less melancholy would have proved to us that our seeds were not the only ones that did not sprout. Nobody's did. So I'm starting to see a bit more of that metaphorical language. Okay, I feel at this point that we're no longer just talking about marigolds, that we're talking about something else. So, but she's still staying in this metaphorical language of lakes and marigolds and everything like that. And we move down into this, how everyone is concerned with Piccola's baby and her baby arriving healthy. And if you do the right things by them, that everything should be all right. So I note off to the side how babies so often bring this to people, this hope, this future of what the future can be, of what the world can be. And I note that off to the side. You can kind of see some of my other notes, but the biggest thing I want to move down to is where we get down here, this last full sentence that we have. It never occurred to either of us that the earth itself might have been unyielding. So in this paragraph, we see two sisters who are blaming each other for the problems in their life. And then they end up kind of blaming themselves. But what doesn't occur to either one of them is that maybe the problem is not necessarily them, but the earth being unyielding. So I made a note down here about this victim thought process. So often in abusive relationships, people develop this thought process of, what I brought this upon myself. What did I do wrong here? Or I deserve this. I did something wrong. And so often the thought process is not, I'm in a bad relationship, I need to get out of this. It's processing what they've been done. And you see that in a lot of broken spirits in abusive relationships, like I kind of pointed out, which goes back to our class's theme about examining of people under kind of oppression and oppressive circumstances. So moving on to the last page, I get down to some of these big questions, and these are kind of what I want to focus on. So questions. Who is this Charlie Breedlove that we meet? So whenever you are reading, especially difficult text, but really any text, you want to pay attention to when you meet a character and how you meet them. So just like how we meet people in real life, first impressions are everything. So when we meet a character first in the book, based off of where we're meeting them, how we're meeting them, how they come across. That has everything to do with how we can kind of interpret this character and what the author's trying to say. The other thing is going back to the significance of the opening of the story with Piccola right after the story of Dick and Jane. So I find it interesting that we open, I'm kind of developing some theories as of the moment, and they might change, but I'm developing some theories that maybe the reason why she starts with the story of Dick and Jane is because Dick and Jane were these children's stories of like happiness and kind of just like go lucky families, and then we immediately go up into this messed up family circumstance. So I want to make note of that we have to pay attention to, what's kind of being said here. What is being said about family structures? And that's my working theory so far. As I work through the book, that theory might change. And then the last thing I want to mention is the significance of setting. So whenever you're reading a text, you want to pay attention to setting. And just like how you meet a character, why do we open in this setting that we do? What does this setting look like? What kind of pictures are painted in this setting? So far, we don't have a clear, direct setting. We know that it's 1941, but that's just about it. The most that we really get is that we're understanding that we're in a negative environment, kind of understanding Piccola's situation and our main character situations and the sister situation. The only for sure aspects of the setting that we get is this picture, this beautiful picture actually of marigolds and lakes, which is interesting that this is such a picturesque image, yet horrible things are happening here. Which makes me go back to that opening with Dick and Jane's story. Is the author trying to create kind of this illusion of good, and that what we see isn't, and what good we see isn't always great, that there's darkness in these settings? So what I'm trying to explain to you is that as you work through these difficult texts, pay attention to the things that you're noticing. If you're confused, that's good. The author is trying to make you notice something. The author's trying to make you make note of the unusual and things that stand out. So as you can see, I own my books, so I write all over them. I keep my books forever. Especially stuff like this that's more complicated. So I feel very comfortable writing all over them. Depending on whether or not you bought your books, I just wanted, you can write in the book if you bought it. If you didn't write in the book, you can also do, or if you didn't buy the book, you can also do post-its. And with post-its, you can write all over them and put them throughout the book. And then also, if you're not comfortable with that either, you can also just do a notebook. But I would strongly encourage you, as you work through these difficult texts, have something that you're writing and you're brainstorming in. And it doesn't have to even necessarily 100% make sense. It just has to make sense to you. So, hold on. So, as you look through your books, go ahead and keep those in mind, and make sure that you are taking note of that, and know that it is okay to be confused. So I'm going to end the video there, and I hope that is beneficial. And if you have any questions, please just let me know.